Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Means with Dan Vrabel, your very own unscripted weekly podcast of the people, by the people, and for the people. I'm your host, Dan Vrabel. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in and welcome you to our sixth official weekly episode, as we have had quite the eventful week with many matters to address, inquiries to resolve, and realms of exploration with which to fundamentally expand our information in. So, without further ado, let us dive into it as we embark upon our search for the greater truth in the world. Perhaps most notably, we have had a rather eventful week, now that we've got that out of the way, within international affairs, as we have seen, most notably, China form a new international mediation group consisting of over 30 nations, namely themselves, their allies in the form of Russia, and newly formed allies throughout Southeastern Asia, including Pakistan, who they had tightened their bonds with following a conflict with India, Bangladesh, who they have tightened their bonds with following the student revolution the year prior, Indonesia, who has tightened their bonds with China in trade deals, and various other East Asian nations, in an effort to exert greater global influence on the world stage. The Chinese Department of Foreign Affairs has stated that this new group for mediation has been formed in order to present beneficial and expedient solutions to the problems of the day. Yet it has, as is rather apparent, been formed for one major primary aim: to expand the global influence of the Chinese state and of Communist China on the world stage. As the 21st century continues to unravel, we have seen China time and time again seek to expand their influence, whether it be through the Belt and Road Initiative, which sought to expand trade networks dependent on China, to attempt to forge greater economic dominance of the Chinese state on the world stage, or whether it be the rapid rearmament program of the Chinese military, the largest of which in the last 100 years, or whether it be the Chinese encroachment upon Taiwan, the South China Sea, or the seizing of control throughout the nation in what has been a crackdown on an already subdued state. The fact of the matter is, no matter what way you slice it or dice it, the Chinese government and the Chinese state has been expanding and has been growing in its strength and influence throughout the last 2 decades in a speed almost unparalleled in the history of man. And its influence has not been extended for any noble goal. No, the Chinese state has been marked and unparalleled for its tyranny and its cruelty towards its civilian population and towards its citizenry. And the Chinese state has served in the 21st century as the leader of a bloc of tyranny, of a bloc and an alliance united not through ideological aims, not through a wider worldview, but solely through opposition to the Western order and through a shared fundamental trait that is tyranny. For the recent global order of tyranny, represented by the three bulwarks of tyranny: communism, headed by China; ultranationalism and militarism, headed by Russia; and Islamic fundamentalism, headed by Iran, has sought to posture itself and present itself as an alternative geopolitical order to the recent noble republican order of Western democratic nations that has been headed since the days of World War II and Franklin Roosevelt by a noble United States of America. And as China has expanded its global influence and has now attempted to officially position itself as an alternative world leader, as opposed to the United States, who has backed off of the world stage in recent years, namely under the isolationist administration of President Donald Trump, we are seeing what is ultimately a new geopolitical order, one of a new Cold War between the forces of Western noble republicanism, represented and what ought to be headed by the United States and our allies in both the European Union, our fellow Pan American republics, and our fellow republics in East Asia, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, India, and various other allied nations, and the forces of tyranny, which has rapidly been headed by Communist China. For in this new Cold War, it is a game of who can exert a wider coalition. For as all global conflicts have proven throughout the last 100 years, it is whoever can form the broader coalition and the broader front that is the one who wins the Cold War. Whether it be the First or Second World War, the great game of the 19th century, or the Cold War that ended but 30 years ago, the winner of a geopolitical struggle has always been the one who has been able to form stronger, firmer, and more reliable alliances, whether it be the Allied powers of World War I and II, who had dozens of nations within their ranks, as opposed to the Axis with only three and four, or in the Cold War, the United States and our aligned republics, numbering in the tens of dozens. Meanwhile, the forces of communism served with only two or three main nations. The fact of the matter is, it is the broader coalition that wins the war for the century. And as it stands now, the United States has only served to isolate itself on the international stage, has only served to decline in its economic standing and its diplomatical prowess. And I fear if we continue to go down this route, the United States is at risk of losing the proverbial war for the 21st century and losing it to the forces of tyranny and communist China. For as China has positioned itself as an alternative world leader, what we need is to combat the forces of tyranny with a strong Western alternative, with the Republican bloc of mutual defense, consisting of our world's republics, namely consisting of the United States and the republics of the Americas, the republics consolidated around the European Union, and the republics of East Asia, forming a threefold bloc of republicanism and the noble virtues of Western civilization. But that is not what we have seen. We have seen the United States continue to isolate itself on the world stage, and we have seen the encroachment of Chinese influence and the forces of tyranny, whether through direct military means, as observed within the Russo Ukrainian War, intimidation, as has been observed within Iran's posturing in recent years, or within diplomatic strategy, as has been demonstrated with the economic measures posed by China. The fact is, if we wish to win the Cold War and the new Cold War for the 21st century, we must posture ourselves not through isolation, but through principled internationalism, and honoring the American duty as the world's foremost republic to defend sacred principles since the times of Jefferson. For if we do not do so, someone else shall. And perhaps that is the way of the world. In other news, we have seen the European Union back the International Criminal Court against United States-led sanctions following a tumultuous several weeks in which, following the International Criminal Court's issuing that they claimed Israel has in recent years committed a claimed genocide upon Palestinian populations, the United States has implemented sanctions upon the International Criminal Court following what appeared to be routine irregularities and questionable ties to foreign entities within the International Criminal Court's procedures, thereby rendering the United States pulling all support from the ICC and causing a standoff between the two entities. Thus, the European Union has now decreed that they will be backing the ICC and condemning American-led sanctions upon the judicial organization, following the dispute over the status of Israel's recent military engagements. And on this matter, one that is rather complex and even mind-boggling to even describe in a single sentence due to its multifaceted complexity, I must say that I have, as would anybody trying to get a hold and trying to grasp this multifaceted combating of institutions, I must say that although I believe a centralized power and centralized power around one organization is the fundamental aim of what we ought to be doing in the 21st century, centralizing power around one entity rather than decentralizing it around different policies from state to state and nation to nation. I do think that the ICC fundamentally got it wrong in their ruling on the Israeli Palestinian conflict. And I do believe, as has been proven through both the South African litigations in the ICC and ties within the UN Security Council, that the International Criminal Court has recently come under unjust and unwarranted influence of the Chinese Communist Party and of the forces of the Chinese led global axis. And thus, I believe that any ruling that has been made in recent years by the ICC ought to be taken by, at the very least, a grain of salt, as they have come under the undue influence of forces that have positioned themselves as adversaries to the American and to the Western order. Having said this, although I do believe that the ICC got it wrong in their ruling of the Israeli Palestinian conflict, and I believe that they did not fully understand the nuances of national defense, I will say that I do believe the United States issuing sanctions upon an international court, although somewhat justified, does take things a little too far and does show a rather dangerous trend of disobedience towards international organizations in what ought to be a hierarchical method of international reigning supreme over the national, national reigning supreme over the state, and the state reigning supreme over the local and the municipal. In other words, centralized authority. But the proper way to combat what would be an unjust authority is not to dismiss it altogether, but to try to positively reinforce our Western influence over the ICC. For if the International Criminal Court has been polluted by the interests of those seeking to discredit the Republican order and the order of our world's democracies, the only solution would be not to cast away international jurisprudence altogether, but to honor the rule of law even more, to honor the rule of law twice as much as our enemies, and to honor the rule of law through exerting our noble influence, an influence that is not mounted on a desire of acquiring more wealth or territory, but influence that is mounted for humanity's sake, for honoring sacred principles like the rule of law, the popular mandate, the freedom of the individual, and the fundamental right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and self determination of peoples, one which has been fundamentally neglected by the International Criminal Court in recent years, and one that ought to be rectified not through isolation, but through the reinforcement of Western Republican influence. For, as I have said before, the rule of law is not written by blood, the sword, and a cold shoulder, but through the mighty word of the pen and the gavel. For if law is not respected by the minds of men, we merely have ideas, ideas that are not grounded by institutions. Moreover, as we have seen the European Union further consolidate their military budget following American pulling military support from both Ukraine and the European Union altogether, we have seen the EU largely step in and pick up where the United States has left off as a potential leader and a potential champion of the Western Republican order. As the EU has passed across the board their largest military budget in history, following an inability to rely upon American security, we have seen the European Union establish numerous base deals stationing each other's troops throughout the member states, most notably the expansion of German troop stationings throughout Eastern Europe to combat what would be a potential Russian threat upon the nations of Europe. And I must say, I have rather mixed feelings on the matter. On one hand, I do firmly believe that a stronger European Union is a grand, noble goal that will benefit the Western world altogether if the United States continues to go down the path of isolation. Although I would prefer, and I really would ideally like to see, for lack of a better vernacular, the United States remain the leader of the Western world. If we are unwilling to honor our time tested, noble obligations to lead the order of republics, then better it be another republic, in this case the republics of Europe, than a tyranny that steps into our shoes as the world leader. For if America wishes to step back on the world stage, let our successors and let our followers be ones of liberty and republicanism, not tyranny and vice. For I fear that if the United States continues to step back on the world stage, we may lose our ground, as has been the current trend, and nations, whether it be the noble forces of the European Union or the less noble forces of Russian and Chinese influence, will take our place on the world stage and will fundamentally claim our stage of influence as world powers, using it not to promote virtue and democracy, but using it to promote their own shallow needs and gains. And frankly, such a vision strikes me as a tragedy, and one that any good man and any man of reason cannot allow to possibly happen and triumph in the 21st century. So I must admit, although I would ideally like to see the United States continue to hold its position as a leader on the world stage, if we are not willing to do so, I passionately welcome the emergence of a stronger, safer, nobler Europe as a potential leader of the world's republics and of the Republican bloc. In other news, we have seen increased violence and unrest within the nation of Turkey following an increased crackdown upon the nation's opposition by the increasingly authoritarian regime of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has in recent years postured himself as an ally of not only Vladimir Putin, but of Islamic fundamentalist interests in the region. As Erdogan, since entering office as prime minister in 2002, has pulled Turkey away from their prior position as a beacon of hope, secularism, and Western prosperity in the Middle East, and has dragged Turkey, kicking and screaming, back into the dark realms of reactionary extremism and Islamic fundamentalism. For, I must admit, Turkey, following their independence in 1922, going all the way up until the election of Erdogan in 2002, had perhaps 80 of the most marvelous years of any Middle Eastern nation in the history of man. For we saw the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a man who revolutionized Turkey and turned Turkey from an isolated husk of the old Ottoman Empire into a secular, prosperous, westernized nation that was not only a founding member of NATO, but one of the leading forces in the Mediterranean and in the Near East in representing pro American Republican interests. And for that glorious 80 years, Turkey served as a beacon of light for what could become a wider renaissance and a wider beacon of prosperity in the Islamic world. That a region is not condemned to suffering, that a region is not condemned to extremism. However, since Erdogan has taken power in 2002, we have seen Turkey continue to backslide, not only moving away from its planned ascension into the European Union, not only abandoning its economic stability, not only abandoning its place as a secular, Western, American ally, but aligning and posturing itself closer with the tyrannical Russian state and closer with the interests of Islamic fundamentalism and radical anti-Western extremism. Therefore, it has been all the more tragic to see Turkey change gradually and to see what was once one of the most noble republics in the world transform into what it has become today. And thus, I would call upon the nations of the West and the Turkish people to continue their show of opposition to Erdogan, who has jailed opposition leaders, cracked down on democratic processes, and continued to rig elections in his favor. And I would call not only on the Turkish people to continue in their resilient show of opposition to this despot, but I would call on NATO to exert greater pressure upon Turkey to can Erdogan and to re-westernize, as Erdogan has only proven to be an ally not of Western republicanism, but a friend of Vladimir Putin and Islamic extremism. Therefore, it saddens me to see a man who was 30 years prior marked as a criminal and a potential extremist take power in a nation that was once the nation of Ataturk, who, in my opinion, may be, not to divulge into history too much, who may be one of the greatest leaders the Islamic world has ever produced, and a man who I must say is one of the few men who I truly admire in history, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. However, moving on into largely domestic news, we have seen a recent surge in Islamic-led terror attacks within the U.S., namely within Boulder, in my own home state of Colorado, in which a peaceful protest and a peaceful rally within Boulder, supporting the Israeli state, was attacked by an Islamic extremist and an illegal immigrant with a flamethrower, injuring dozens and causing a statewide scare. And I must admit, seeing the recent surge in the last several months of largely Islamic fundamentalist bombings and terror attacks throughout the U.S., whether it be the New Orleans terror attack last year, the recent bombings throughout the eastern United States, the killing of Israeli embassy workers by pro-Islamic Palestinian extremists in Washington, D.C., or the flamethrower attacks on Boulder, I must say that both the United States and the nations of Europe have seen an unprecedented and a rather frightening surge in Islamic fundamentalist terror, and one that ought to be combated not out of sectarian divisions, but out of a sense of preserving the security of our nation and preserving the security of our citizens. For Western civilization and the noble people of the West ought not to live in fear of terror attacks in their own homes, on their own streets, in their own neighborhoods, and in their own nations. We should not have to fear terror attacks by marginal extremists, many of whom have entered the country through illegal immigration routes, and we should not have to fear for our lives. Frankly, I think it's a tragedy that we have not been able to fundamentally combat terror and Islamic extremism throughout the West. For we have seen in the last several decades, since the plague of Islamic terror began several decades prior, we have seen not only the rise in apologists who seek to defend and justify the actions of terrorists, but we have seen many who seek to posture themselves as self-proclaimed freedom fighters in their own right. However, these men and women have not been freedom fighters. They have merely been apologists and sympathizers with terror. And terror that now plagues not only our allies, but our very streets. So I would call upon the United States government to take greater action to combat and prevent attacks of terror of any kind, and to combat Islamic extremism throughout the Western world. For we do so not for an ideological reason, but for humanity's sake, and for the health and the virtues of our republic. Furthermore, we have seen the feud between President Donald Trump and former puppet master Elon Musk escalate in recent weeks, As we have seen Musk, following his departure from the Trump administration, having ran the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which had been most notably responsible for the unconstitutional firing of tens of thousands of American workers, and the currently unresolved disappearance of hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars without a trace, has, following not only leaving the Trump administration, but condemning Trump's proposed Big Beautiful Bill Act as detrimental to the national debt, has continued to harangue his former ally in both his own media through X, or what is honestly Twitter, and the other streams of American media, leading to an escalation of this feud between the two titans of the right. As we have seen, Elon Musk reportedly claim Trump's presence within the Epstein files, which were incompletely released earlier this year. And if we are honest, Donald Trump, who has been photographed and known as a longtime friend of Jeffrey Epstein back in the 2000s, probably has some connections with. But beyond all that nonsense, we have seen Trump threaten to pull federal subsidies and contracts for Elon Musk's organizations and for Elon Musk's business ventures, something which I also support, as government subsidies for Musk's projects, which have largely not been fruitful, and thus would be beneficial for him to cut the subsidies that he established in the first place. And as we have seen Musk call for Trump's impeachment and Trump call for Musk's deportation, I must admit that this conflict has been absolutely hilarious. For as I saw Elon Musk commit a lion's share of the corruption and the pillaging within the second Trump administration, I cannot help but be overjoyed to see not only his departure from government, but to see a falling out between these two men who but months prior were close allies and but years before were, as they are again now, vicious enemies. And I must say, as members of the left and right have taken inconsistent and rather interesting sides and takes upon the Trump Musk conflict, although both men are corrupt, and although Donald Trump has been admittedly one of the most incompetent administrators in living memory, the damage caused by Elon Musk in his short, several week stint in American government far exceeds the damage that Trump has done over the last decade, or the damage that Trump even could do. For although I have my fair share of gripes with the Trump administration, and I am in no way and will very likely never become a defender of the Trump administration's actions, I must admit that a lion's share of my disgruntled sentiments held towards the Trump administration at present stem not from the actions of Donald Trump himself, but more from the actions of Elon Musk, who has, in the span of a couple weeks, done more to detriment our institutions and to gut the powers of our federal government than any president since James Buchanan. And I must say, although I am no fan of Trump, I wholesale absolutely welcome removing Elon Musk from the government and cutting down on his unjust, undue influence upon American politics. And it's funny. Feuds between men create the strangest of bedfellows, as we have seen an odd coalition of left-wing Democrats who previously despised Musk, free trade small government Republicans such as Rand Paul and Musk himself align, while Trump, alongside a numerous amount of progressives, have aligned against Musk. So I must say this entire conflict has been hilarious. And if I had to choose between the lesser of two evils, the unstable, incompetent administrator or the crooked foreign monopolizer, I think I could put up with Trump any day over Mr. Musk. However, as Trump has continued to threaten Musk with deportation, rather interestingly, Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has offered Elon Musk potential haven, which, as Musk has cozied up to the Russian administration in recent years, I cannot help but find immensely hilarious as well. And I think both myself and millions of Americans who stood by and watched Musk pillage and denigrate the American federal government cannot help but take in and at the very least feel a sense of relief knowing that Musk is out and knowing that the devil we know is better than the devil we almost got to know. So, I, for one, would like to say good riddance. However, we have seen in other news immigration protests within the city of Los Angeles, California, protesting the actions of ICE, or the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, turn rapidly violent in LA as protesters burned nearby cars and attempted to storm and violently attack ICE buildings and administrative centers throughout LA. And Trump, in response, has sent in the National Guard into California and has stated that he intends on federalizing the National Guard, centralizing it not around the states but around a strong federal government. And I must say, although I find many of Trump's statements hypocritical, including the fact that he has cracked down on insurrections and violence of the left, but not the right, I will support any and all efforts for law and order and preventing violent, un American protests and rioting in our streets. So I must say, although I have my fair share of gripes with Trump's hypocritical security policy and his fair share of incompetencies, I do support cracking down on illegal, violent actions against the government. And I do support the proposal of nationalizing the federal guard in order to further centralize the American government to ensure the federal supremacy as guaranteed within the United States Constitution and to ensure that law and order and security wins the day. However, I cannot help but also find it ironic that many Republicans, namely Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, who had been former South Dakota governor, has now all of a sudden declared her support for the policy of centralizing the National Guard when a couple years prior, Democrat Joe Biden proposed the exact same policy. She was one of the lead voices in opposition to such a policy. And thus, I must once again call out a great flaw in the American political system, in that we have policies, good or bad, that are endorsed by one side first, and thus half of the country automatically, without prior thought, declares stubborn opposition to a policy, while the other half declares their undying support. For this method of politics, determined by tribal allegiances, cannot persist if we wish to have a noble republic and a republic of conscience. For if we cannot deliberate matters for ourselves and make decisions as best befitting the circumstance, we are no better than the barbaric tribes and savage tribal allegiances that preceded us. And frankly, it fills me with a great deal of sadness to see such vacillation and to see such tribalism consume American politics. Meanwhile, we have seen the state of California under Governor Gavin Newsom threaten to stop paying taxes to the federal government following Trump's actions in the state and following Trump's threats of pulling federal funding. And although I must admit that pulling federal funding from any state for political reasons would be gravely unjust, I cannot, will not, and shall not support the state of California in their attempt and in their threat to stop paying taxes to the federal government. For if we have a state that can nullify federal laws because they do not feel like following them, or a state that can decide to stop paying taxes because they simply do not agree with the federal government's overall drive, we lack the unity and the order to be one nation. For it has been a near immortal truth of our republic, that we are, as a people, citizens of one nation, not two, nor four, nor even 50, but one nation, united under the virtues of the Constitution and the Republic. So to see Gavin Newsom, or to see any politician for that matter, left or right, seek to establish the supremacy of the state over the supremacy of a strong national government is arguably one of the greatest threats to our republic of recent decades, and has been the type of behavior that we have not seen since the obstructionism of John Calhoun in the nullification crisis and of the Confederacy in the Civil War. So I, for one, must oppose any and all attempts of states, left or right, red or blue, to condemn and refuse to follow the actions of the federal government. For doing so goes against the unity, the stability, and the order of our nation. Moreover, as we have seen that Meta trial over antitrust violations in Meta versus FTC end proceedings this week, we await the verdict of the United States federal courts following a tumultuous trial in which Meta, under Mark Zuckerberg, has gone under a great deal of scrutiny for violating American anti-monopoly law and for forming monopolies that violate American competition law. And I must say, although this matter has largely gone unnoticed by much of the media, I think that the overall verdict of this case will be pivotal in America's economic future. For the courts at this very juncture have the noble opportunity to rectify their prior mistakes in Microsoft v. FTC, in establishing the primacy and the relevance of American antitrust law and American competition law as established in the Sherman Antitrust Act in the 21st century. For although unlikely, the courts now have the fate of our nation's economy in their hands. They have the potential to rule either in favor of un-American, largely foreign monopolies, or they have a chance to rule in favor of a free and fair market, of all American competition, of a noble spirit of enterprise, and of breaking up monopolies and guaranteeing honest competition in a free and fair, all-American market. For as we have the opportunity to rule that monopolies are un-American and violate antitrust law, we face a great risk in our nation, as we have in recent decades seen the economic market of our nation be dominated not by the small businessman, not by emerging new corporations, but by a select handful of small corporations, namely the big five of American tech. These five giants, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Meta, and Amazon, we have seen the consolidation of the American market around the hands of the few and not the many. We have seen the American market lose its free, genuine, unobstructed nature, and we have seen competition replaced by cronyism. We have seen free markets replaced by clientelism. And frankly, I must say, it is not a free market and it is not an honest market if one man or one organization is able to have a monopoly. For in that case, one man is the sole buyer, the sole seller. He is a law unto himself and a tyrant unto the masses. And thus, we the people must be steadfast in combating monopolies and in combating the un-American tendency of monopolies in the market. And although it is unlikely for the court to rule with the Federal Trade Commission, we must be steadfast in passing new legislation to reaffirm the American tradition of antitrust and of honoring the free market as we have done since the days of John Sherman and Teddy Roosevelt, those grand fathers of the free market. Moreover, we have seen lead Democratic Party members in hopes of persuading and gaining popular support ahead of the 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential elections move away from cultural leftism, cultural radicalism, and the wokeism as described by former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg that has predominantly defined the Democratic Party in recent years. As we have seen, a majority of lead Democratic Party officials and candidates seek to distance themselves from the identity politics of recent years that reached its height in the Kamala Harris campaign of 2024. We have seen Democrats who previously embraced identity politics, namely former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, senatorial officials including Michigan Senator Elisa Slotkin, Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, and even progressive New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, former Obama level administrator Rahm Emanuel, former California Governor Gavin Newsom, and even Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman, all lead Democratic officials and potential candidates in 2028, express their distancing away from the identity politics and the divisive extremism of recent years in the Democratic Party. And as we have seen, a majority of the Democratic Party move away from the cultural radicalism and the divisive, unpopular identity politics of the recent years, I must say I am overjoyed to see this correction, and I am overjoyed to see the Democratic Party moderate in recent months. However, the one notable voice who has yet to moderate and who has expressed not only a hesitancy towards moderation, but a drive for greater extremism and radicalism has been New York Congresswoman and now leader of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC, who has now served as a successor to Bernie Sanders as the leader of the radical faction of the Democratic Party. So, as the Democratic Party now splits furthermore into two factions as the old establishment withers away, namely the radicals under Cortez and a new coalition of moderates and fiscal populists, we have a new opportunity as a nation to back a distancing away from identity politics. And we have an opportunity to see the moderate faction of the Democratic Party potentially prevail. However, to do so, they would need to find a new leader, a new charismatic voice that can be to the moderates what Cortez has been to the radicals and what Trump has been to the MAGA movement. We need someone who can fundamentally lead the voice and cause for reason, someone who is socially moderate, economically populist, and is tireless in his fight for the American people. What we need is a leader of the rational movement within America. For otherwise, I fear we may further decline and delude into radicalism, which has, as the recent years have proven, only served to detriment the prosperity of the American people, and has only degraded our national standing and our national integrity. In international news, we have seen recent elections cause rather interesting outcomes, namely the victory of conservative Karol Nawrocki in the Polish election that occurred last week. Nawrocki, who has established himself as a rather interesting European conservative in the typical Polish fashion, has been strong in favor of welfare programs, strong on defense, aggressive in combating Russia, and supporting a united European front against Russia, while supporting moderate social conservative reforms. And I must admit, as I have said before, a European conservative who acts more in the spirit of the European social contract and in the duties of big government is far easier, in my opinion, to support and to justify than a conservative of any other brand or stripe. For I must admit, the victory of Karol Nawrocki is one that I take with a great sense of satisfaction, and although I had previously been neutral, I must say, in retrospect, I feel that this is the ideal outcome. For Nauraki has not only been a professional historian who has made it his mission to study the errors of tyranny and the virtues of republicanism, but he has been a man whose life story is paralleled by very few. He started off as an underground opposition organizer in communist Poland, has an arrest warrant that is valid to this day in Russia for demolishing pro Russian monuments. He was an underground boxer, a professional athlete, and a renowned historian on both the crimes committed by Soviet Russia in their occupation of Poland and Nazi Germany in their occupation. He is a student of man and a student of the world, and he is a devoted paternalist who I think will be one of the great leaders of Europe in the years to come. And I only welcome him to embrace the European identity more, for if he does so, he can be one of the great leaders of our time. Meanwhile, we have seen in South Korea the narrow victory of liberal Lee Mae-jung in their presidential election following the controversial impeachment of conservative Yoon Suk-yeol, who attempted to overthrow the South Korean government in December of last year, in what we now can surmise was a mental breakdown of the politician following years of stress. And I must say, although the victory was rather apparent, myself and the people and observers of the world were rather surprised to see the narrow margin of victory that Jung received following a tumultuous and unpopular administration of his conservative predecessor. However, there are concerns that Jung, as a liberal, may be too soft on China and North Korea. However, only time shall truly tell. Lastly, in our weekly official section regarding what, if anything, our Congress has been able to do here in America, Bill Watch, we have seen Trump's big, beautiful bill meet strong opposition within the Senate as it now looks unlikely to pass, as both the entire Democratic Party and an increasingly large segment of Republicans have expressed opposition to the bill. Most notably, opposition that has been expressed within both House and Senate Republicans to the new provision which prevents any states from regulating AI in the next 10 years. And I must admit, to see this energy come from the Republican Party fills me with great joy. To see reaction and opposition towards the pro AI, pro fraud, and un American policies and provisions of this bill. And I encourage both the Republican Party and Congress as a whole to continue their opposition to any and all government policy that favors and encourages the removal and the phasing out of American jobs. For if the American worker cannot have the dignity of work and the prosperity that comes therein, we cannot have the dignity and the prosperity that ought to be entitled to and granted to a nation that is the world's foremost republic. However, beyond this, we have seen Congress produce no further bill, no further result, and no further solution to the issues that plague the average everyday American. And I must say, I am tired of speaking about Congress and seeing nothing get done. For if the American people do not have a government that can govern for them, they will turn their desires and their affections elsewhere, as they have done in recent years. So I conclude this episode by saying, just as it is a civilization's duty to look after her government, it is a government's duty to look after her civilization. And if a government's end of the social contract is not held up in the noble spirit of a republic, we are at risk of losing our position as a noble republic, and we are at risk of losing our people's faith in our government, and faith that would be rightly lost. So, in conclusion, tune in next week as we have many matters to address which have yet to reveal themselves, and inquiries to resolve. As always, thank you for listening, and have a wonderful evening.